All right, and that is Mets General Manager Brody Van Wagenen with the word for the fans. And now we are being joined by a special guest, Joshua Garcia. He is a writer with the Beacon. He covers baseball and boxing. He is all over. He was in Vegas this past weekend for some big-time fights, so we'll get to that in a few minutes with Josh as he has to school me on the world of boxing, as that is not one of my strong points. So we'll get to that in a minute. But first, I'm going to bring Josh in. Josh, are you there, buddy?
Hey, Samori, you there?
Yep. Hey, thank you for joining us. And I know that you were at the press conference today to introduce Carlos Beltran. So what's your thoughts on the hiring?
I thought it was a great hire. You know, a lot of these guys in baseball, they're very young, especially the Mets. They have a very young core. And, you know, a guy like Joe Girardi, not to badmouth Joe Girardi, but he's a very, you know, militant-style guy. Carlos Beltran kind of, you know, leads the guys along. He's not going to tell them what to do. He's going to just help them in their development. So, you know, it wasn't great letting Joe Girardi go to the Phillies and having to play him 18 times a year, but, you know, Carlos Beltran is a much better fit for the Mets.
And how do you think that him being not only a former player, but he was a star player, someone who everyone in the world of baseball knows, these players now who he will be managing, they all came up knowing who Carlos Beltran was. Just how much do you think that could mean something to the players as opposed to having, say, a Mickey Callaway, the previous Mets manager, who none of these ball players knew who he was in terms of having played a game?
It's just when the words come out of the manager's mouth, they hold a lot more weight. When it's somebody of Carlos Beltran's, you know, status, who's been in those locker rooms, who's been in those situations, who's been on the big stage. He's been in New York. He's played, you know, for the Yankees. He's played for the Mets. He knows everything about New York. Like he said 3 or 4 times in the press conference today, you know, it's not really like a new thing for him. He knows New York. He lives in New York. His family is in New York. It's just so comfortable for him. And the players are going to feed off of that. The players are going to see how comfortable he is. You know, Mickey, I don't really think felt so comfortable. He was kind of looking over his shoulder in his decisions. He was kind of looking to the front office for leadership, direction. And Carlos Beltran comes in with experience, with leadership, with, you know, his words mean a lot. So the players are going to feed off of that, and I believe you're going to see it come next season.
And Carlos today, he spoke about his former manager with the Mets, manager who was the manager before Mickey Callaway, Terry Collins, a guy who managed Beltran early in what was his managerial tenure, talking about Collins. And by the time Beltran was gone early in Collins' tenure, but by the end of Collins' tenure, he led the Mets to the World Series in 2015 and also to the playoff the next year, 2016. Now Carlos spoke today about Terry Collins possibly joining him as the bench coach, maybe, but he did say that Terry has reached out to him, and Terry is someone who he respects dearly, and it sounds like to me that of all the managers that Carlos has had, he respects and he got the most out of Terry Collins. So what do you think about the possibility of Collins now joining the dugout again, but not as the manager, as the bench coach? And do you think that would be awkward for Terry, something that he would want to do? How about that?
There's no doubt there's going to be days where there's a butting of heads between Terry and Carlos. There's no doubt going to be those days because both of them think they're right. Both of them are going to go off of their experience. You know, then you throw in analytics. There's going to be days where they argue back and forth. But there's one thing you have to say about Terry Collins. And everybody on that Met team, while he was present with the Mets, will tell you, there might not be a manager out in baseball that cares more for his players than Terry Collins, that has his back more than Terry Collins. So if Carlos Beltran can learn that, mimic that, adapt that into his managerial style because, he's never done this before. It's going to be a feeling out process, and he's going to pick up things along the way that he wants to use, or he's going to use things and then throw them away because they didn't work. And one of the things that he could pick up from Terry Collins is that, having your players back, going out there to argue or, just making your guys feel like, man, my manager, he really has my back. He really cares for me. And that's one thing that Carlos Beltran could borrow, from Terry, and will have a good mentor in Terry Collins when it comes to things like that.
Carlos Beltran, a great player, a great guy. He was somebody who, when he was with the Mets, I was covering Met games then, and I remember one time that I asked him for an interview before a game, and here's this big star. I'm this young reporter just starting and all that, and he don't really know me. And he sat down with me, gave me the time. I'll never forget that. So he's a great guy. Now, in terms of him being the manager, I'll admit, I did not think that he should have been the Mets' first choice, but I think definitely hiring him is if you're not going to hire who I thought they should have hired, I thought they should have hired either Joe Girardi, former Yankee manager who we know that he can do the job, he has experience, or Buck Showalter, another guy who has great credentials, and he turned around so many teams in his day, in his career, and I just felt like the Mets needed somebody who you knew could do the job, and not another first-year guy who you really have no idea if he can do it or not. But at the same time, the hiring of Beltran is very exciting. It's definitely a storyline that I'll be excited to follow next season. So even though I think he's a good choice if you're going to hire a first-year manager, I think that they should not have hired a first-year manager and should have done their best to hire Girardi or Buck or maybe even Dusty Baker. So, Jess, what do you feel about that, and do you think that the Mets did the right thing by not going with experience?
Well, I feel like you might be a little trigger shy because of Mickey Callaway, and other first-year guys. But, let's be real. When you compare Carlos Beltran to Aaron Boone or Craig Counsell or Alex Cora, any of the former players, he's by far the most superior player that's a manager. So he definitely provides a higher level to me than those guys, and it's kind of not a good comparison in my opinion because he was just such a better player, He's got a different mentality, he's got a different, resume coming in, and, with respect to those guys like Boone and Counsell, they just weren't the players that Carlos Beltran was.
Yeah, and those guys had success as first-year managers. Some may argue that there was more stability and just more of the foundation, more talent, support, whatever you want to call it, with the Red Sox and the Yankees. But yes, those guys, they did have success as first-year managers, and so now Beltran will get his shot now. And at the end of the day, it's just baseball. It's not rocket science. So Beltran is a lifelong baseball man, and he knows the game. And that definitely, what I find interesting, Josh, and I'll let your take on this, he was in the front office with the Yankees, and that's kind of interesting because now Beltran is the manager of the Mets, and we know that the Yankees and Mets, they definitely have a rivalry, whatever it may be. I mean, they don't play each other. They're not in the same division, but they play each other every year for a few games, and the Mets always have to deal with being a professional ball club in the same city as this powerhouse, the Yankees, the Yankees speak for themselves. They have a roster, a lineup of stars who they throw out there every day. The Mets got to compete with that, and so we know there's that rivalry. Now, the Mets have gotten somebody who was right next to the Yankee general manager, Brian Cashman. Beltran, I'm sure, knows a lot of the Yankee secrets or what have you, so it's kind of interesting where you get a guy who was so close to the Yankee general manager. Now the Mets bring him in. He's their manager. So, Jess, how about that dynamic right there?
Well, part of him, I'm sure, looks at Aaron Boone and says, that could have been my job, or, maybe I could have done this that, Boone didn't do, or I could have done this better, or so to me, Beltran is probably looking at those 4 games next year. Like, I'd really like to stick it to the Yankees for not hiring me. He loves the Yankees. He had his time with the Yankees, but, at the end of the day, they didn't give him an opportunity like the New York Mets did. So I think part of him is going to want to, do better than the Yankees, want to keep one eye on the Yankees so he can one-up them. And it's hard to do here in New York. Like you said, you share a market with, it's David and Goliath here in New York. But, if David can beat Goliath 4 times next year or, 3-1, I think Beltran and the Mets will be feeling pretty good about it.
Okay, now, Josh, you are on the boxing scene, and that's a scene where I have not spent too much time in my time covering sports, So there was a big action going on this past weekend in Vegas. You were out there covering all of it on the scene. So just how was that, and what were the big fights that took place, and how did everything go down?
It was a great night for boxing. I mean, UFC had their big-time event as well on Saturday, so there was a little bit of conflict between the two. But it was an amazing fight week in Vegas. All the stars were out. All the celebrities were out. Fight week is something different than every other sport. You have an event almost every day leading up to the main event, and there's just people from all over the world that come, and there's, concerts and parties and things surrounding it. And it's just an event that is incomparable almost to anything else. You might be able to compare it to like the Olympics, but it's just something that is different, And I got to speak with Evander Holyfield, who his son made his pro debut actually on Saturday on the undercard of Canelo and Kovalev. And, this is a guy who beat Mike Tyson, one of the few people on the earth who can say they beat Mike Tyson. And he was nervous and giddy like a school kid, like a normal fan to see his son. And that was something so cool to see a legend like that, so excited for a fight. He's been there, done that. And he's excited like, he's a teenager, like he's never fought before. So, that's the type of emotion that goes into it. And, a lot of people said the main event, it was slow and Canelo fought a different type of fight. But at the end of the day, it was a spectacular knockout, which is what every boxing fan, fight game fan wants to see. Everybody goes to see the knockout, and you got it. So money's worth. Everybody walked away happy, and Canelo made history.
Definitely, and Canelo, he beat Kovalev, and that was always big when Canelo was fighting. So, Jess, my final question to you before we get out of here, what do you think of the path that Canelo was on, and where is he at right now in his career?
Canelo wants to be historical. He doesn't want to be good. He doesn't want to be one of the best. He wants to be the best. So he went up 2 weight classes. He's a guy who fights around 168, 160, and he went all the way up to 175. And he's fought at catch weights in his career, which means, when you fight a guy bigger than you or a guy smaller than you, you meet somewhere in the middle. Well, he went all the way up to 175. His team told me he's never been a weightlifting guy. He doesn't lift weights. He does a lot of cardio. He does a lot of pool work. He does, calisthenics, but he is not a weightlifter. He has never been a weightlifter. And for this particular fight, he lifted weights and lifted weights and lifted weights to put on muscle to get up to 175. And he looked bigger than anybody's ever seen him. But when he stood next to Kovalev, it looked like a giant next to, an average man, because the size was so much bigger for Kovalev. Kovalev could be a cruiserweight. He's that big. And, Canelo's a true middleweight. And just the fact that somebody of that size could fight and beat somebody of that size, you have to say that man is a risk taker. And in boxing, especially in this era, guys avoid fighters. Guys avoid fights, and promoters convince their fighter not to fight certain people so they won't lose. And you have a guy like Canelo who fights 2 divisions above his weight class and beat a champion to take a belt at a level nobody thought he could compete at, you have to respect that. You know, he's a risk taker, and you have to respect that in the fight game.
All right, Joshua, we are out of time, so we have to leave it there. Everyone, we've been joined by Joshua Garcia, beat writer with the Beacon for boxing and the baseball here in the Big Apple. Joshua, it was great talking to you. Thanks for joining us, and we got to have you on again soon, have you come in the studio and talk to you for the whole hour and really get into this boxing scene and everything that's going on.
Hey, thanks, Samori. It was great.
All right, Joshua, so I'll talk to you soon. Thanks again.